The night air over the Irrawaddy in May 1945 hung heavy and close, a warm, wet blanket that blurred outlines and softened sounds. In the darkened jungle, the world reduced itself to small circles of torchlight, to the rasp of breath, to the tight geometry of trenches and foxholes, to the sudden tongue flare of an enemy grenade. For men on a forward post, the night was not an abstract backdrop, but a physical presence. The jungle pressed in on all sides. The path that cut through it was a line of danger, and every footstep beyond the trees might be an enemy coming to test the line. On one such narrow patch of earth, a rifleman stood his ground through a storm of explosives, suffering wounds so terrible that any ordinary man would have collapsed. Instead, he fought on, for hours, with half a body and a stubborn will. His name was Lachhiman Gurung. For his actions that night, he received the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry in the British and Commonwealth forces. The legal record of that award, the citation published in the London Gazette, sets out the bare bones of what occurred. In the early hours of May 13, 1945, at or near Taungdaw on the Irrawaddy, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung of the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles picked up and threw back 2 grenades that had been thrown into his trench. And when a third exploded as he tried to return it, he lost the fingers of his right hand, had his right arm shattered, and was otherwise severely wounded. Despite this, he loaded and fired his rifle with his left hand for 4 hours and held his post against numerous enemy attacks. London Gazette, July 24, 1945. That short formal paragraph anchors everything that follows, and from it the longer human story can be told, of who he was, what the fighting was like, what his injuries cost him, and how his life afterward unfolded under the weight of history and memory. Lachhiman Gurung was born at the end of 1917 in the Chitwan district of Nepal, in a small village where the rhythms of life were set by seasons and the demands of subsistence farming. He belonged to the Gurung community, one of Nepal's hill peoples who for generations had supplied soldiers to the British Indian Army. Military service provided a steady wage, a structured path out of village poverty, and a measure of social standing for families left behind. From the vantage of the British recruiting officers of the early 20th century, the Gurkha soldier was prized for his physical resilience, his mountain familiarity, and an image of loyalty and fearlessness that became the core of a long and complicated relationship between the hill peoples of Nepal and the imperial military machine. In December 1940, a young Lachhiman registered for service and was posted to the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, a unit that would later form part of the 89th Indian Infantry Brigade and fight through the grueling campaigns of Burma. Regimental Records, Gurkha Museum. The nature of Gurkha service was both practical and cultural. Enlistment meant training in weapons, fieldcraft, night patrolling, and small unit tactics, the exact skills that jungle warfare would demand. Gurkha units were prized for their ability to scout, to send cutting parties along narrow trails, and to hold ground in thick terrain where larger formations struggled to operate. For recruits like Lachhiman, the companionship of a small band of men, the clarity of orders, and the discipline of the regiment offered a way to face the uncertainties of war. Yet the same machinery that trained them for battle also placed them in the front lines of the empire's conflicts. For many Gurkha recruits, the war was both a duty and a livelihood, a mixture of pragmatic concern for family back home and a code of honor tightly bound to the regiment. By 1945, the Burma campaign had shifted into a punishing endgame. The Allies were driving west across the Irrawaddy, pressing Japanese formations out of defensive strongholds and seeking to cut retreat routes. Terrain and climate conspired against maneuver. Jungle and river terraces, monsoon mud, and hot, insect-dense nights. Small features, tracks, ridges, river lips, acquired strategic value, and forward posts that controlled a path through the jungle could be worth more than their size implied. In such conditions, an assault might be local, violent, and surprisingly personal. Grenades lobbed into trenches, sudden swarms of men closing with bayonets and knives, and firefights at distances of a few yards. The 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, was engaged in this environment, and on the night of 12-13 May, one such forward post became a stage for an act that would be recorded in the annals of the regiment and the official citation of the Crown. The attack began in the small hours. The enemy, Japanese forces still capable of fierce local action, mounted a considerable force estimated by contemporaries to be around 200 men. They moved under the cloak of darkness in waves, seeking to overrun or at least probe the company's positions. The forward trench that Rifleman Gurung manned commanded a jungle track, a vital choke point. When the first grenades were tossed into the trench, it was a moment of acute danger. A close quarters blast and fragmentation make a trench a precarious coffin. Gurung's instinctive reaction was to pick up and throw back the first grenade. He repeated the action with a second. On the third, while he tried to return it, the grenade detonated in his hand. The blast removed the fingers of his right hand, shattered his right forearm, and inflicted severe wounds to his face and right eye, while also damaging his right leg. His 2 comrades were badly wounded in the same engagement, leaving Gurung essentially alone in the trench. London Gazette citation. It is in the particulars, the hand torn, the arm broken, the face bloodied, that the image locks. A man whose body had been so battered that normal function should have been impossible, but who somehow managed to reload a bolt-action rifle with his left hand and to keep the weapon firing, repelling attackers at point-blank range for hours. To modern readers, the physics of such an act can seem miraculous. The human body under massive trauma will often shut down. Shock, blood loss, and pain typically incapacitate even the fittest soldier. Yet contemporary medical and veteran testimony offers possible explanations for how an injured man could continue fighting. The immediate rush of adrenaline, the job-focused compartmentalization trained into soldiers, the blunt force numbing that sometimes follows catastrophic injury, and the imperative supply by the context. If a post falls, the wider position is in danger. In Gurung's case, these factors likely combined. The citations note that he maintained steady fire for 4 hours, suggests a pattern of the enemy pressing forward in repeated efforts, then withdrawing to reform, then assaulting again, sufficient intervals for a wounded defender to reload and resume fire. But even allowing for physiology and training, the mental toughness needed to sustain that rhythm under terrible pain remains exceptional. Eyewitness and regimental accounts corroborate the main outline of the Gazette citation without significantly altering its terms. The Gurkha Museum and regimental histories preserve memory of the deed in the language of unit pride. Later obituaries and retrospective articles expand the picture with human detail. Comrades described seeing him covered in blood and missing fingers but still firing. Villagers later remembered the quiet return of a decorated man to his homeland. Journalists recorded the low-key way Gurkha veterans received recognition after the war. The convergence of these accounts with the official citation strengthens confidence that the core facts are grounded in contemporaneous reports and after-action statements rather than later invention. The medical aftermath of a grenade blast of that nature was severe. Removing fingers and shattering a forearm commonly resulted in significant blood loss and often required amputation or prosthetic surgery in later years. Facial and ocular wounds could be disfiguring and debilitating. In 1945, surgical techniques were robust enough to save lives, but lacked many modern reconstructive options, so scarring and permanent impairment were common outcomes. Gurung's survival and return to civilian life indicate both the resourcefulness of wartime medical services in the theater and the enduring toughness of the man himself. He was carried through the chain of evacuation to larger medical units, where surgeons and orderlies worked to stabilize him. The scars he bore thereafter were visible marks of that night: absence of fingers, impairment of his right eye, and the residual damage of shrapnel. Awards like the Victoria Cross follow a formal process. Eyewitness statements, officer recommendations, and a chain of endorsement culminating in publication in the London Gazette. The Gazette's entry, brief and juridical, serves as the historical anchor. It sets the dates, the facts, and the language of commendation. For Gurung, the VC citation was published on July 24, 1945. The wording emphasizes his throwing back of grenades, his grievous wounds, and his sustained left-handed firing over 4 hours. Phrasing that would echo in regimental histories, in museum displays, and in the obituaries that marked his passing decades later. After the award came investiture, the public ceremonial presentation of the medal. Records indicate that he received his Victoria Cross at an investiture in India late in 1945. Media accounts and regimental records placed the formal presentation in the months following the Gazette announcement, a time when many colonial troops were still stationed in or moving through India after the collapse of Japanese control in Southeast Asia. The post-war life of Lachhiman Gurung unfolded under the twin lights of recognition and hardship. He is recorded as having retained the honorifics associated with a decorated soldier. Later references list him with an honorary rank, and he became a symbolic figure for Gurkha pride and for the struggles of colonial veterans to secure recognition and fair treatment after empire. For decades, veterans of the Gurkha regiments navigated a complex web of responsibilities and rewards. Loyalty to the regiment and to comrades, insufficient state welfare, and the shifting politics of the post-colonial world. In the UK and Nepal, the politics of Gurkha settlement and pension rights emerged as a significant public issue in the 1990s and 2000s. Lachhiman's later residence in Hounslow, West London, and the public support he received through the Gurkha Welfare Trust connected his personal narrative to the larger movement for the rights of Gurkha veterans. Press reports in the 1990s noted grants and public ceremonies that acknowledged his service and sought to ameliorate post-war hardship. When he died in December 2010, aged 92, his passing prompted obituaries that recounted both the wartime deed and the arc of his later life. Newspapers like The Guardian and The Telegraph remembered the stark elements of his action. Grenades thrown, fingers lost for hours of left-handed firing, while also situating him in the long history of Gurkha service and the later politics of veterans' welfare. The ritual of remembrance that follows the death of a VC recipient, funerals with military honors, regimental commemoration, and museum exhibition, places the individual act into the broader fabric of collective memory. His medal, like many VC awards, became an object of institutional memory. It is recorded in regimental and museum holdings, its story displayed to visitors as a narrative of courage linked to the sacrifices of colonial troops in a global war. To understand the deed in context, one must grasp both the small and the large, the particularity of a night attack on a jungle track, and the longer history of Gurkha recruitment, imperial service, and post-war adjustment. Gurkhas had, by the mid-20th century, developed a reputation within military circles as exceptional light infantry, trained to operate in difficult terrain, to conduct night patrols, and to meet enemy incursions aggressively. Their reputation was both an asset and a constraint. It brought pride and recognition, but also bound them tightly to the needs of imperial defense. For many, Gurkha soldiers' enlistment was a rational response to limited local economic opportunities. For the empire, it was a way of staffing far-flung garrisons with soldiers habituated to difficult environments. The Victoria Cross itself is a symbol with two faces. On the one hand, it is an honorific, a public recognition of a single exemplary act of bravery, visible and legible across languages and cultures. On the other hand, it sits within the political frame of empire, awarded by the monarch, circulated by the instruments of state, and later repurposed in narratives of national memory. For colonial troops, the VC sometimes provided moral leverage in later campaigns for recognition and welfare. an argument that those who had bled for the crown deserved the material supports of the society they had defended. Lachhiman's later life, his participation or proximity to campaigns for Gurkha rights, and the public visibility of his decoration made him part of that negotiation between symbolic honor and material justice. The tactical picture of what occurred at Taungdaw can be sketched from military doctrine and the citation's details. A forward post on a jungle track was usually a small, shallow trench intended to deny movement along a path. At night, the attackers' preferred methods included grenades to produce shock and to clear the trench, followed by bayonet and close-quarter fighting. Throwing a grenade back into the jungle to detonate away from the trench was one of the defenders' last-ditch options. It required quick thinking and courage because the grenade's fuse might be almost spent, or because the grenade could be purposefully thrown to land deep in the trench. The risk of handling a live grenade is manifest. Gurung's first 2 successful returns prevented immediate internal detonations, but the third's explosion in his hand produced catastrophic injuries. The account of his continuing to fire with his left hand indicates repeated enemy attempts to exploit the breach. His steady fire denied their success. That denial had tactical consequences. The forward post held, the enemy failed to exploit the track, and the larger defensive network remained intact. Beyond the immediate tactical effect, what mattered for commemoration was the narrative coherence. A soldier who picks up a grenade and throws it back, who loses fingers, yet continues firing left-handed for hours. This is an image that concentrates meaning. It embodies a stoic refusal to cede ground, an ethic of duty and sacrifice, and a dramatic physical motif that translates into a succinct citation. The London Gazette's terse legal language captures that motif and, by doing so, canonizes it. The brief citation is a legal artifact and also a story generator for regimental history, museum displays, and public memory. Examining the sources is critical to responsible historical writing. The London Gazette remains the core primary source for the facts of the award. Date, place, description of deed. Regimental records and the Gurkha Museum provide unit context and later administrative detail about investiture and medal custody. Obituaries in reputable newspapers supply human detail, later life, public recognition, and civic activities, while specialist military histories and feature articles offer interpretive context and broader background on the Burma campaign and the nature of Gurkha service. When contradictions appear over the exact phrasing of an alleged battlefield utterance, for instance, historians privilege contemporaneous and official records for factual claims and treat later recollections as interpretive or illustrative. That method avoids turning anecdote into fact without basis, while still allowing the texture of human recollection to flesh out the official skeleton. If a documentary producer were to turn this narrative into a film, a suitable approach would be to interweave archival material. Photographs of Gurkha soldiers in training, maps of the Irrawaddy, the scan page of the Gazette citation, with on-camera interviews from regimental historians, medical historians to explain blast injuries and their treatment in 1945, and representatives of Gurkha welfare organizations to speak to the later life politics. The cinematic arc would move from the small, the cramped trench and the grenade, to the large, the consequences for a community, the politics of remembrance, and the medal's place in the post-colonial conversation about veterans' rights. Visual sensitivity is crucial. Depictions of injury should be handled with care, focusing on resilience and human dignity rather than shock. The human consequences of war, in the long view, are as important as the tactical particulars. Lachhiman Gurung lived a long life after 1945, his body a ledger of the wounds he absorbed and the resilience he embodied. He participated in veteran life, in regimental memory events, and in the struggles that defined Gurkha veterans' relationship to the British state in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. His presence in Hounslow and his interactions with local civic authorities were markers of a larger movement. Former colonial soldiers seeking to be recognized and supported. The Victoria Cross gave him a public platform, but it did not free him from the material difficulties many veterans faced. The medal's symbolic power, however, did carry weight in public discussions about compensation, resettlement, and welfare. At the end of life, obituaries and memorial events gathered the threads. His death in December 2010 prompted public remembrance that tied the wartime deed to the long arc of Gurkha service. The medal's custody, often recorded in regimental or museum holdings, ensured that future visitors could see a physical token of the night at Taungdaw. Museums and regimental displays continued to tell the story, situating it among other acts of courage and offering interpretive frames that sought to honor the soldier while also situating the act within the politics of empire and post-imperial memory. There is finally a moral dimension that runs through the story. Courage in war does not erase the complexities of the political relationships that produced the war's manpower. The Gurkha's courage at Taungdaw is unambiguous in its bravery. The later questions about pensions, settlement, and recognition are matters of justice and policy. Telling the story faithfully means not only dwelling on the immediate spectacle of bravery, but also tracing the afterlife of that bravery in policies, in public remembrance, and in the living communities that retain memory. The Victoria Cross awarded to Lachhiman Gurung remains an emblem of personal heroism, but it also stands as a prompt to remember, to question, and to ensure that institutions reciprocate the sacrifices they once demanded. If the story is to be read as both history and meditation, the image that stays is of a wounded man in a dark trench, his right hand gone, his face wounded, his arm broken, his rifle clutched in his left, firing at men who repeatedly surged and fell back, and in that simple, terrible sequence erecting a barrier that cost lives and steadied a line. That physical image anchors the rest. The medical recovery and its limitations, the investiture and its public ceremony, the later advocacy for Gurkha rights, and the eventual, quiet return to a village or to a London borough where late-life ceremonies mark the passing of a generation. Men like Lachhiman were both instruments of war and living bridges to a past that younger generations must learn to understand with both empathy and critical reflection. When we close the book on the narrative, the facts still matter. The London Gazette citation lists the essential sequence. Regimental archives locate him in the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles. Obituaries and museum records confirm later life milestones. But beyond the facts is the human record, the pain and endurance, the solidarity of comrades, the small acts, picking up a grenade, throwing it back, that become the pivot points of history. Remembering Lachhiman Gurung is not merely to catalog an act of bravery. It is to trace the human cost of a global conflict and to hold in mind how societies honor, or fail to honor, the men and women who fought their wars.